You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
So some of this comes from Bella Abzug not liking Richard Nixon that much. Or maybe from a South Carolina delegate who feared the Spanish fleet. Or from a president who started a war that history now calls a war, but labeled it something else. It was just the neighborhood constable swinging the nightstick around a bit.
In the final hours of the battle for Grenada, the Americans were still pouring in more combat troops who arrived at the new airport, one wave following another.
All of these things have led to where we are with what we call presidential war powers and around a specific piece of congressional legislation, which still drives action today. Yes, even the recent events in Venezuela, but was all written and passed in the 1970s and not significantly legislatively changed since that time. So we're still going to talk about it. And I'm going to talk a bit about my 2011 podcast on the war powers that I did back when Obama was president and he was considering action against Libya. And these issues came up because they really haven't changed. I almost just reran my episode from 2011, but I found that there's some interesting development.
The build-up coincided with the arrival of helicopter gunships, all urgently needed reinforcements to end the fighting as quickly as possible. In the words of one American officer, they were using whatever it takes to free the island. But even as these men came ashore, the invasion forces were still facing intense fire from the last remaining Cuban strongholds in the hills surrounding the airport.
I mean, the recent news in Venezuela raises history. You know, you do have to consider the classic example of the presidential use of war power, Grenada, 1983.
We saw planes coming in, going out. We saw the battleships.
Radio Free Grenada that was, we think, bombed on, exploded 3 or 4 times. We were told afterwards it was an ammunition site that they had blown up. The Holiday Inn was burned down while we were watching last night. A good part of it, I don't know how much of it.
And President Reagan does not consult with Congress before he sends troops to that island. But he does file appropriate reports. Already a problem, perhaps, because war powers requires advance notice. And so in the 80s, you get into this whole argument over notification versus consultation, with Tip O'Neill and others in Congress saying, we weren't consulted, we were simply notified. And we're going to talk about why that one word is very important.
I have a brief statement to be followed by a brief press conference because I have a pain in the neck. Well, our efforts to support the democratic processes in Panama and to ensure continued safety of American citizens.
In 1989, George H.W. Bush orders Operation Just Cause. Now, this is probably going to be the analog that people are going to be looking at to remove Manuel Noriega without prior congressional authorization. It was the introduction of U.S. armed forces into hostilities. And in 1973, the Congress had said that when you do that, the president must consult with Congress in every possible instance before introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent.
Now moving into its second day. Military forces in achieving their objectives. I'm pleased that the Indara government is taking charge, and they made several appointments in the exercise. They've demonstrated the highest standards of courage and excellence.
One congresswoman that we're going to talk about, Bella Abzug, really an early feminist representative of New York, later ran for mayor. We've talked about her in the past, very flashy and things like that. Did not like Nixon very much, refused to shake his hand when it was offered in the State of the Union. There's even a famous story that she raised a certain finger to the president at one time. Certainly in legislation, she did that, as we'll talk about. One of the things that she says, and this reflects the view of Congress over time, is that we're tired accepting that the president can start wars and then we fund them because we have to support soldiers, right? We don't want soldiers to go without food and supplies and lose because of us. But our silence is indicating support when the support may not be there. And that is the battle between Congress and the president that has gone on for some time. Lee Hamilton in 1989 and a few other congressmen say that, we didn't get consultation on Operation Just Cause. He's the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We just got notification that, hey, I'm sending troops. George Bush complies procedurally with the type of regulations that he needs to, notifying Congress within the retired time frame and asserting legal justifications. He's protecting U.S. citizens, he says. He's defending treaty obligations. There's obligations related to the Panama Canal. We handed over sovereignty to Panama, but they still have obligations and they have to be enforced. If they're not enforced, why even sign a treaty? And there were attacks on U.S. personnel, but they did not, Bush administration, seek advance authorization. Now, if you remember, I had talked about, this is going back a bit, so I understand if you don't remember, in Reagan, Ronald Reagan's episode 12, the very last one, we talked about how Reagan, while he was still president, was confronted with this Noriega thing. And he said absolutely not, because he thinks it's going to lead to a war. Just cause does not lead to a war. However, there are casualties. There are a limited number of casualties. And Ohio vs. the World podcast does a very good episode, which talks to the mother of one of those people that lost his life in Operation Just Cause. And listen, I mean, Noriega's a dictator. It's not a fun country to live in during his time. But still, these issues are raised. And the issues are, at what point do you need to get Congress involved, given the constitutional obligations? When does a small action using military forces lead to bigger problems? Iraq, what would be the second attack from American forces on Iraq in 2003, was a fairly quick operation, and Saddam Hussein is captured within the year of 2003. And yet there are still troops there for a decade and a half. And we have the corresponding Afghanistan campaign for 20 years. These things must be considered, all of those consequences. And I started this podcast in 2006, so My History Can Beat Up Your Politics is a 20-year podcast, okay? And 2006, we were mid into these type of issues. People were angry. A lot of times, I think, and missed particularly the spin of the Trump administration and the Biden administration that was polarizing as well, depending on what side you're on things. Both administrations have been polarizing. We forget that when this podcast started during the Bush administration, there was a tremendous amount of polarization, and people were angry about that war and how it had gone. You were either angry that we did it at all, or angry of how it was being handled, and it could be handled better. Some saw the surge of 2007 as repairing it somewhat. We have some procedures of how president works with Congress, but it's complicated. And I'm afraid that what I see in the long view of history is that those complications have allowed the executive, which only the executive can, to seize the authority. Again, my last episode was in 2011, and that's when President Obama sent troops along with the French and the British in an operation to institute regime change with Gaddafi. President Obama does file a report to Congress within 48 hours. But he later argues that U.S. forces were not engaged in hostilities for purposes of the 60-day clock. And Congress rejects that logic, and the administration just simply is reporting and not doing it. We're going to talk about the 60-day requirement. In 2017 and 2018, this is relevant because it was the same president, President Trump, properly notifies Congress under the War Powers Resolution, which we're going to talk about in more detail. But essentially, he has on the phone House Speaker Paul Ryan, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, also House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer are on the line when he's notifying Congress about this strike, which was a signal to the Syrian government that they needed to not use chemical weapons. He notifies them before these strikes are carried out in that case. Now, there are Democrats today who wouldn't be satisfied with just someone like a Pelosi or a Schumer representing them entirely on the phone call, because they would argue there's nuances and grades of opinion within the opposition party that all need to be heard. When does that occur? With American national security and politics, it's not really precise as to when that does occur. It's not clear whether any section report was filed at all at the time I'm writing and composing and recording this, which is very fast. I usually don't do episodes under this much, speed, but we have the information. Let's talk about it. We don't know what's going to happen moving forward. It involves the use of military force to seize a sitting foreign head of state. That means actual hostilities or imminent hostilities. If Congress is informed after the fact, you could argue that the statutory trigger was pulled without the required written notice. The 1973 War Powers Resolution is the real name of it. Legislation specifies that you must, when you're putting troops in harm's way, consult with Congress. And Congress needs to be consulted in good faith. So there's going to be a lot of debates about this. Here's what I said back in 2011. Maybe if Bella Abzug didn't hate Richard Nixon so much, maybe if a South Carolina delegate to the Constitutional Convention didn't fear the Spanish fleet, maybe if one word had been changed in the document, and maybe if a Maltese or Italian official didn't betray us in the 1980s, there wouldn't be as much debate over this War Powers Act legislation. In 1973, the Congress, smug with Nixon's declining approval rating, eager to take advantage of their congressional powers, approaching a midterm year, angry about Watergate, angry that Congress had been misled in the Gulf of Tonkin measure with another president, and perhaps with some of Nixon's moves as well in Vietnam, all of the bombing halts mixed with continued bombing, expansion into other countries. Congress wanted to rein in what they saw as a new American imperial president, and they passed the War Powers Act. Now, I want to stress, it's about Nixon, but it's not just about Nixon, because many of them in their mind had LBJ as well. These weren't Democrats passing this legislation in Congress or pushing it that were fans of LBJ necessarily in his Vietnam policy. The WPR requires that the president notifies the Congress between 48 hours of the use of military forces and in 60 days submit the action to approval. So the clock starts ticking once that notification is made. Nixon doesn't like this measure. He has a whole bunch of reasons that it's going to cripple a president from being able to respond, that allies and what we're thinking about in 1973, South Vietnam has not yet fallen, but you do have an agreement between the South Vietnamese, the U.S., and the North Vietnamese in Paris that is essentially going to stop the Vietnam War. The Congress is real concerned that any little element is going to wake up the presidential powers in effect and wake up the Vietnam War into fighting again, which they don't want. And so they're trying to start some incident, that maybe Nixon can put troops in harm's way and then they're fired upon, and then that continues to prolong this highly unpopular war. And it caused significant American casualties, over 50,000 casualties. Many of those during Nixon's presidency, by the way. Even though the first peace talks are starting before Nixon becomes president. Liberals look at this law that's coming out of the Congress. We're going to talk about some of the congressional leaders. And it's coming more from the moderates. And in general, they're saying, this is too generous. Here you're giving the president 60 days of free action. The first decision made by the president, not by Congress. 60 days to use American forces. By then, they'll be in some faraway land. And then what is the Congress to do? Nothing. These are real concerns. And among liberals that oppose it are New York Congresswomen Bella Abzug and Litz Holtzman, who originally voted no when the measures first voted on. But now Nixon vetoes it. And first of all, you have Speaker Carl Albert going out there and saying, I need all the votes I can get. Can anyone switch here? We know you have reservations, but this is a chance to deal the president, the enemy of our party, the guy you hate, a big blow that's going to weaken him. And then you can get anything you want after that. Abzug couldn't resist. She hated Nixon viscerally. And policy considerations may have taken a back seat. A weakened Nixon, to be sure. His veto is overridden. So now, when Gerald Ford becomes president later, he has to comply with Congress's legislation when there is a case of attacking and boarding a Cambodian vessel which had attacked a Navy ship. Nixon would have argued in the past, I want the ability to just attack that ship that attacked one of our vessels. Ford complies with this law and gives notification to Congress. Reagan sends troops to Lebanon, notifies Congress. President Bush sends 500,000 troops to Kuwait and later sent troops to Somalia. Clinton uses force in Yugoslavia while these actions occurred. Presidents held the War Power Act, all of them, Democrat and Republican, in some kind of legal limbo. They enjoyed its provisions, especially the quick notice and the 60-day provision, but holding the act somewhat of a legal reserve. They could challenge it because it might, as many legal scholars suggest, be in violation of the separation of powers. So they were complying, but not really complying. And as we're going to discuss, both President Bushes, the father and the son, sort of said in their actions in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, we want Congress to approve this, but we don't need it. It's a little strange, right? It's like, we'll comply, but we don't really agree with this. And if we need to, we're going to go to court and get this overturned. And almost all presidents have kept this in a kind of, they don't really want to do that consultation part. In the War Powers Act, what you really have is this little bit of congressional micromanaging on the commander-in-chief, allowing Congress to pull troops out if they want and go beyond the prescribed role that they have, perhaps, which should be declaring the war and the power of the purse. But maybe it's not, right? Maybe this is a little constitutional switcheroo, but maybe it's not, because what the Congress is in effect saying in 1973 as a body and with a lot of different opinions is, we'll give you some of our power in terms of declaring that you need to use military force, which should be our purview. This is how we're going to rein it in exchange. So I think that there is an acknowledgement here that if you're going to take our power to declare war because it's no longer possible in the modern sense of the word, and I always want to think about when people don't like a living constitution, it never seems to be this issue that they're talking about, right? You've definitely changed the meaning on declaring war in some ways because your argument would be from a national security perspective that modern events have outlived the language of the Constitution about declaring wars, right? And I'm very sympathetic to that, being someone who believes that interpretations can change over time. I just do find it funny that's only on this issue where we can accept some living constitution. But the Congress of 73 just wanted to take their place back and say, look, we're not saying, at least in this compromise legislation, we're not saying that we always have to declare war for any soldier in the U.S. to fire a gun. But we want some rules around it since we do see it as a change. Congress hasn't been in the war declaring business for some time. It was 1941 when it declared war on Japan in response to them declaring war on us and declared war on Germany. They approved, or at least some of the Vietnam actions that Johnson and Nixon took, they approved of. They approved of the first Gulf War. After a contentious vote, there was a debate over whether to contain Saddam Hussein back in 1991 or whether to attack. And there were approval votes for the Iraq and Afghanistan war. They weren't declarations as prescribed by the Constitution, even though you constantly hear about the Patriot Act and the authorization to use force as a war on terror. Congress never declared that war on terror. And increasingly, you saw both Republican and Democratic critics of ever engaging in that authorization, because the authorization to use force in 2002 goes on for a very long time, beyond what anybody voting for it could have imagined. A lot of this stems from Harry Truman, as we're going to discuss. First, I want to talk about some of the leaders behind 1973 and the War Powers Resolution, and one of them is Clement Zablocki. He was the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee at this time. Not a firebrand, not an absolutist. He believed in alliances, diplomacy, and most importantly, Zablocki wanted a congressional process. He didn't like all of the anti-war guys. And that's in this legislation. He wanted a statute that would force consultation and shared responsibility for wars, for the national security that we need to accomplish between the president and the Congress. He didn't want to cripple the president. In the late 70s, Zablocki sponsored and passed the Case Zablocki Act, requiring the executive branch to report international agreements to Congress. So it's a similar thing. Same with the WPR. He wants sunlight, reporting, and institutional parity. Bella Abzug came from a more confrontational place, as we had discussed, worried that war powers wasn't strong enough, didn't give Congress enough power. She came to Congress as a Vietnam protest figure, far less interested in compromise. Her instinct was that presidents would evade any statute that did not contain hard withdrawal mandates and unmistakable votes. She pushed for sharper language than the WPR had. She thought it was one notch in the ladder, not a finished product when she voted for it. And she, again, only voted for it after the veto to override Nixon's veto. Senator Thomas Eagleton plays a part as well in this war powers legislation. He had been somewhat disgraced as the VP candidate and had to step down after there was, unfortunately it was a different time about mental health awareness, and he had received electrocution therapy, and that came out, and McGovern just couldn't keep him on the ticket. He, again, was not instinctively anti-presidential, but he saw, as many congressional people did, about how there's these incremental commitments, and you're making commitments to other countries, you're pursuing treaties, and all of a sudden we're in war, and Congress has never even checked it. Congress trained itself to react after the fact. No more. Let's get involved before inertia takes over. And that's why he supports this. And he's by no means, even though he did try to run with McGovern, he was the balancing on that ticket. He was no means a member of, say, the New Left or anything like that. Eagleton, with a Missouri senator with strong labor support. Truman plays a role here. The Korean War stands as the high watermark of presidential unilateral war making. President Truman commits large U.S. combat forces without a declaration of war. This is right after World War II, when there had been a declaration of war. He doesn't even get congressional approval in any form. He grounds his decision in Article 2. He says, I'm the commander-in-chief. And a new thing, which has, if you're really hardcore on the Congress must declare war, you see this as a devilish trend. He cites the United Nations. So, well, I have obligations. We have a treaty with the United Nations. We have to perform our obligations. I don't have time to wait for a congressional approval. He calls it a police action, famously. And that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows and cause him political problems. Korea is not a popular war. And it's going to hurt him in the midterms of 1950, and it's going to hurt Democrats in 1952. Truman's not concerned with that. He sees this as him having to take a stand because China is helping the North Koreans to overrun the peninsula. But make no mistake, this is there's often a theory that war always helps the party in power. And 1952 is not a good example of that. Democrats certainly didn't benefit as a party for being in Korea. In fact, it's one of Eisenhower's key issues. But up until Korea, Congress declared wars. 2 wars in our history, 1812, Spanish-American War, were pushed not by some imperial president. They're pushed more by the Congress than the president. McKinley's probably wants a war with Spain or some type of quick one or a complete capitulation on the diplomatic scene that Spain, although willing to do something desperate to cook a deal, wasn't going to totally surrender to the United States either. McKinley probably wanted something there, but whether he wanted a full war is doubtful, and Congress was certainly pushing, Congress and the media. 1812, the same thing. You have the famous war hawks, Calhoun and Clay, rivals later, who were pushing that war. And the presidents, Madison is very reluctant leading up to that war declaration. It starts with a bit of oversight, a bit of sloppiness, perhaps something missing in the well-thought-out Virginia Plan, which was the model for the Constitution. When you have the Constitutional Convention, you should be known that there's already a blueprint brought. And Washington, the most important figure in the country, has already signed off on it. James Mason, Edmund Randolph, George Washington agreed ahead of time, before going to the convention. Hope would frame the agenda. Now, it does not as much as they think. It hits a few bumps in the road. Edmund Randolph introduced the Virginia Plan in the beginning of that Constitutional Convention. The plan includes a phrase that Congress would be in charge of using force to force a member of the Union to comply if it rebelled. Something like that. But otherwise, defaulted to the Articles of Confederation powers, which said the United States Congress assembled. Now, here's the issue. There wasn't a president. There was a president of the Congress, but there wasn't a U.S. president under the Articles of Confederation that he was defaulting to. So in this absence, the Virginia Plan, this main blueprint, is not commenting on how we start wars. 9 states in the Confederation must agree to a war. That's 2/3. And the officers would be appointed by their own states. It's a very difficult way to conduct a war. They found that out in the Revolution when Continental Congress was running that war effort. And if you talk to George Washington, the general, he always felt he was not being adequately supplied by that Congress, and they were not paying adequate attention to what his soldiers were going through. Certainly, we went over that history of Valley Forge, and any soldier that fought in Valley Forge would want some stronger system than what they got, the management of a war by Congress during the Revolution. As you can imagine, Edmund Randolph, who had introduced this Virginia Plan, realized there was a gaping hole. There was no provision for an emergency, for a foreign invasion. And after some discussion, it was decided that they would add to the Constitution the ability of Congress to make war, declare war. But Charles Pinckney had a problem with that. The delegate from South Carolina felt that a group of men, such as the House of Representatives, couldn't run a war in an emergency. What about a large Indian invasion? What about an invasion from one of many foreign fleets operating? I'm in South Carolina. I have the port of Charleston here. All of the enemy fleets, I shouldn't say enemy fleets at this point, all of the world fleets, the British fleet, the Spanish fleet, the French fleet, are bigger than ours. You had Spanish nations on the border of Georgia. You had English forts on the border of various American states. And the French were always threatening some amount of influence in the new nation. What if there was an emergency? Pinckney suggested that perhaps we give this power to the Senate. The group of elder statesmen may be able to run a war better than the lot in Congress. But Pierce Butler disagreed. He thought that even the Senate would be just as incapable to run a war as the House would be. So this matter does not get resolved. And like so many things, it goes to this little group, the Committee of Detail, which decided to go with the phrase, declare war, that Congress would declare war. That would leave the president as commander-in-chief to fight the war that Congress declared. Roger Sherman of Connecticut thought that declare was not the same as make, and that would make the Congress weaker. In other words, so this debate actually happens at the Constitutional Convention, which really does anchor all the debates of today. What are you doing when you're declaring war? Right? Are you just putting this stamp on it, saying, okay, Truman sent troops to Korea. Oh, war is there. Or is it, as I would imagine 90% of Americans think, when you say declare war, that you're making war, that you're starting a war, that you're officially announcing the beginning of a conflict. And without that declaration, it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. Sherman's concerned with this. Yet a motion to remove the president from the commander-in-chief role, once the phrase declare was added to Congress's role, fails. The Constitutional Convention's voting by states. And we don't have a record of every word that's said, but we do have a record of the votes. That vote fails. So we know that idea to take the president out of it wasn't something the Constitutional Convention was interested in. Two things weigh heavily on delegates' minds. One was the incapability of the Continental Congress to really run the Revolutionary War and supply all of that. And the other is the threat of a foreign invasion. So if you're looking for how the president got involved in all of this, that's how. Well, Roger Sherman was probably right, though. Despite trying to wrestle control from him, it was Abraham Lincoln and not Congress who ran the war effort during the Civil War. Although I will say, Congress, particularly the Committee on the Conduct of the War, once it started not to go well in the beginning, there was a lot of after the fact. You did not want to be a Union general going before the congressional leaders, the angry congressional leaders, and it could be career ruining. President Reagan, not Speaker Tip O'Neill, sent scores of aircraft to punish Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 1986, after he brazenly supported terrorists who bombed the Rome and Vienna airports in that year, and after it was found that Libyan agents were involved. Later tried and convicted by a German court of having responsibility in a Berlin discotheque bombing that had killed Americans. President Reagan would inform the Speaker of the House, but it was Reagan acting as commander-in-chief per the Constitution that launched those planes. Government buildings in Libya were targeted. Military targets were part of the bombing. But the real target in 1986 was Gaddafi himself. The mission would include U.S. and British airplanes, but the nations of France, Italy, and Spain all denied the U.S. use of their airspace. Controversial. Controversial thing happens. It's either the Prime Minister of Malta or an Italian official with Libyan ties, or someone else, during this discussion about airspace, warns Gaddafi about the impending attack. And so he's not there at home when the bomb hits his compound. He's never killed. So that's going to come several decades later. He's still a problem. The incident buoyed the U.S. over Vietnam and improved the image of President Reagan, the toughness of the United States. All of these things you can see. Some are rhetorical. My memory of this Libya attack is the Howard Stern show. Yes, he goes back that far, where Howard Stern is taking John Cougar Mellencamp's song ROCK in the USA and saying KILL, kill Gaddafi. The weird thing is Gaddafi expresses his desire to become an ally of the United States during the George W. Bush administration, and relations are established during that administration. But just for a short time. Just for a short time. In Operation Odyssey Dawn, Belgian, Danish, Italian, Spanish, and French airplanes, along with Canadian, U.S., and British airplanes, participate, bombing aircraft shelters, government buildings, military targets. Gaddafi's not ostensibly a target of the 2011 operation, but at least one general said it would not be a terrible thing if he was hit. The idea is to reduce his ability to attack his own people, support the rebellion in his country, and they avoided using the term regime change, but again, it was one of those things that seemed like a side benefit, supported by the UN, support in the Arab League, and though when the bombing actually happened, the Arab League quickly said they didn't agree with the scope of the operation. And so, I've been podcasting for 20 years, so I had already had this podcast for several years when I did a podcast on war powers, right as these planes were being launched and when we didn't know what was going to happen with Libya. And I compared it to Jefferson's actions against the Barbary pirates. The Marine song that goes from the halls of Montezuma, Mexico, to the shores of Tripoli. We probably know the Montezuma part, the Mexican War, but the shores of Tripoli refers to Thomas Jefferson's effort to combat the Barbary pirates, especially the recalcitrant Tripoli. The war was a bit of a budget saver, really. The pirates had been a problem for the United States even before we were a United States. But certainly in the early going, once we declare independence, the Tripoli pirates had had a deal going with the British, and that severed. And so American shipping is at jeopardy as we're just a fledgling new republic. And they're charging nations all over the world to pay a tribute, or we'll attack your shipping. Most nations in the world were getting their surplus income from trade. France paid up, England paid up. Pirates, as we said, new nation, new deal. You're not covered by Britain anymore. Pay the vig. We send representatives over. We try to work out a deal. They do. The U.S. works out a deal with Algeria. But the Barbary pirates are separate from Algeria. And they ask for something like $660,000. A big chunk of the federal budget. Might have been a third of the budget at the time they asked for it. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson suggested that we reject any kind of tribute. But the tributes are paid in some form by the Confederation Congress. A deal is worked out, and then by President Washington, and then President Adams also must comply. When he becomes president, Thomas Jefferson does try to work out a reasonable deal. He couldn't get it, and so he sends Navy ships and Marines to Tripoli to end the piracy. The battles go back and forth between 1803 and 1804. Our small navy, most of the entire fleet was sent far, far away. We also have supporters on land in these nations who want a new government. The battles went back and forth between these years. We sank many private vessels. They captured one of our Navy ships, the Philadelphia, and its crew. We later were able to reboard the ship and burn the ship so they could not use it against us anymore. Trying to attack Tripoli directly was difficult, and the U.S. was repelled after a couple of attempts, but some Marines, helped by a large mercenary force of Algerian Greek Egyptians, attack the port. I'm going to say Algerians, Greeks, and Egyptians, get that right, attacked the port of Dima, a different Barbary city, and captured the city and flew the American flag over this African port. That's just a sight. You could believe it in like 1804 to see American flag, this new nation over the... this is certainly something to be proud of in our history. The Navy had been successful in a foreign land. The Marines had been successful in a foreign land. We stood up to the pirates. Jefferson didn't get any congressional approval to send those ships in. He did inform Congress afterwards, and the action was popular enough that no one would disapprove. Yet it's really a small force set, and it's a small war. There's not implications for the entire continent up and down for all of the states, except they're going to get a break if they're doing trade in this area. When another Southern former governor was elected, he, like Jefferson, wasn't entering office being known for his military prowess or his ability to use a sword, but he would seek to compel a foreign nation far away to agree with American policy by using American force. But it wasn't piracy that William Clinton was concerned with. It was innocents being killed in the faraway province of Kosovo, arguably not yet its own country, part of Yugoslavia at that time. But Yugoslavia is fractured, and to the extent it has a government, it's dominated by the Serbs. Yugoslavia is a hotspot in an otherwise peaceful world with only one superpower remaining, as people saw it at the time in the 90s. One superpower. A superpower that had reduced at least the rate of increase in its military spending. Never cut it, but reduced the rate of increase under Clinton. And closed bases, closed camps. When the Kosovo Liberation Army rebelled to get its independent state of its own, retaliation from the federal Yugoslav army, which is really the Serbs, was swift. The U.S. tries several times to get peace talks. The Serbs won't allow the Kosovo government to separate. They walk out of negotiations. Then came battles and a civilian massacre. One murder of 60 civilians triggered Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State under Clinton, to say, this is not an internal matter anymore. You can't say this is an internal matter of the federal Yugoslav Republic. We're here, we're watching, the U.S. has a role. They don't immediately act. Negotiations tried. Yeltsin, head of Russia at this time, tries to work out an agreement with Slobodan Milosevic. There's always been an alliance since before World War I between Serbs and Russians. A short-lived Macedonia negotiation lasts until December 1998, but then war had broken out all over Kosovo. And the KLA took over various towns in the south, and the Yugoslav army enters Kosovo and attempts to take back everything by force. Now you've got a war on the ground. By 1999, NATO ordered Yugoslav forces to leave Kosovo. They will not. Now NATO, not the UN, NATO begins bombing to push Serbia out of Kosovo. They bomb military targets in Belgrade. It also bombed what were called dual-use targets. Military jargon that meant things that could be used by the military, but also could be used by civilians, such as bridges. Bridges are going to get your army across the river, but they're also used by civilians. The same with telecommunication centers. You're going to knock out all of the phone systems. Despite all this bombing and the pounding that it's taking, Slobodan Milosevic is still resisting, and in fact had stepped up the allegedly the massacre of civilians. A NATO general suggests we're going to need ground troops. Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, comes to Chicago and argues for ground forces. Very shocking moment. And Clinton says no. Absolutely not. He wants to avoid this being a ground war. The Russians don't like this war very much. Various Balkan countries didn't like that the U.S. was bombed. But it was entirely an air war. And the Serbs certainly weren't happy. Eventually, Milosevic agrees, after a negotiation with Finland and Russia, to give in. Clinton had compelled Yugoslavia to stop massacring its people without the loss of a single American soldier. There was a plane or two shot down, but they were able to rescue the crews. In fact, there's a big incident where a stealth bomber is shut down. So it's not like there weren't negative things during that Serbian war. I think it hurt our relations with Russia quite a bit. I think that leads to later relationship with Putin. If you ask me, this is one of those key events on the Russian grievance list. I know the Greeks didn't like it very much. I remember at the time I was living in an area of New York City that had a big Greek population. Lots of signs on telephone poles against this war, even it being just an air war. But there's also a little hiccup with China where we bomb one of China's embassy by mistake. Kill one of their top television anchors is killed in Belgrade by a U.S. bomb. Not so good. So there's a lot of negative moments, but it works in that it lasts from March to June of 1999. And, you see the effect of it. Going back to 2011, we saw some strange reactions like Denis Kucinich, liberal congressman, always known for extreme statements, was asking for the impeachment of Obama over the Libya event. And you have to remember, the Libya event occurs while Iraq and Afghanistan are still technically going on. Iraq's being wrapped up, but it's still going on. So as we had discussed earlier, once the United Nations was created, it became a standard for presidential action that UN approval become part of the issue. And in fact, if UN approval was granted, and that's UN Security Committee approval, which is, I should say Security Council approval, which is the US, China, Russia, France, and the UK. Their position on that Security Council has everything to do with Potsdam and the powers that were there at the end of World War II. And it's difficult because to get U.S. Security Council approval, often we have to have Russia at least abstain, or China at least abstain from inactivity. That happens in Libya. But when they abstain, they're able to criticize the operation, which is exactly what happens in the events of Libya. One thing I want to discuss when we talk about war powers is that there was a discussion of this during the Biden administration, 2023, 2024. It just happened that there was some interest in reforming the war powers resolution. And you have scholars such as Rebecca Ingber who argued that Congress needs to rebuild the legal architecture of this War Powers Act and stop relying on informal pressure. Stop relying on, Congress isn't happy. We need to actually get this into law. That you have to tighten definitions. What does hostilities mean from its 1973 meaning? What does that mean now in 2023? What is mandatory congressional votes? When are they required? What does notification, what does consultation mean? Those two words. Can you remove workarounds that treat silence or funding as approval? It's the Clinton administration at a certain point who argues we didn't get approval from Congress in 60 days, but they funded our effort, so we're going to consider that approval. Bills were introduced, hearings were held, Congress never passed a comprehensive revision. Matthew Waxman, a prominent national security law scholar, professor of law at Columbia Law School, directing the National Security Law Program at the time, wrote a viewpoint on this. And he said the practical difference between a world of strong legal checks and one of weak legal checks is narrower than many reformists reckon. Korea and Vietnam loom large in memory, but day-to-day war-making is constrained less by bright light statutes than by congressional politics, signaling, funding, anticipation of backlash. In other words, what Waxman argues, what's going to rein in a president is congressional shame upon that president, is backlash from the Congress that Congress isn't going to approve, not some type of law that you write. Politicians are motivated by politics. He wrote a paper at the time, March 2024, in the Yale Review Forum, War Powers Reform a Skeptical View. He contended that reformers overestimate how much formal legal rule changes will change real-world decisions. Congress already exerts substantial influence through political, budgetary, and oversight mechanisms. And often, before wars begin and during the conflict, even when legal constraints appear weak. Tightening the war powers resolution would not meaningfully reduce unnecessary wars. That's according to Waxman. Waxman considers the war powers resolution to be a contested and weakly enforced statute. Presidents repeatedly narrow its triggers by arguing that certain operations do not constitute hostilities, or that funding amounts imply approval. We've talked about this before. Courts have declined to enforce the statute directly. So WPR is now limited to being more of like a political signaling mechanism. You violated War Powers Act, that Congress can point at the president. And you see that, like Tim Kaine, for instance, in Virginia, has been someone that has continuously asked for war powers provisions to be met. Now, here's a final thing that I find very interesting. If we go to the Bush administration and Iraq, Assistant Attorney General John Yoo, he argued that the authority granted to Congress should be curbed. Founders reserved for the president the power to initiate wars and gave Congress the power merely to ratify them, to determine what the legal status of a conflict is, and to provide appropriate funding thereby. If you're declaring a war, presumably you've got to fund it. If it's something smaller, you're going to use your power of purse to keep the president in check. This is Yu's argument, paraphrased a bit. The president has inherent executive authority to initiate wars as commander-in-chief under Article 2, Section 2, and as part of the power of the office. The interesting thing is that John Woo has criticized the attacking of boats, allegedly of drug cartel people that are coming out of Venezuela. He's attacked that, and he's been skeptical of the most recent use of executive power and if law was followed properly vis-a-vis President Congress over the Venezuelan issue. So you have kind of a disagreement of someone that came out of that Bush assertion of executive authority about what Trump is doing now. So in this case, the administration is trying to frame the Maduro operation as part of a law enforcement action. It's against narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, rather than a traditional military engagement. Senator Chris Murray, other critics have argued, no, this is an act of war. You've taken out the leader of a sovereign country and brought him to our country for trial. Okay, yes, that has law enforcement aspects, but what you're doing is leading to war. You're also saying you're going to run the country in his absence. In addition to war powers, I think it's worth briefly discussing the Monroe Doctrine here because you're seeing this in effect. And I just watched Secretary of State Marco Rubio say on Meet the Press, I believe, that, Russia, China, other countries should take notice that they should not be involved in this hemisphere. Only the U.S. will be involved in this hemisphere. That's an interesting argument. It does resemble the Monroe Doctrine, but what the Monroe Doctrine, at least in terms of how it's been used over the years, has involved is, we don't want foreign intervention like the old world countries of Europe coming and carving up South America, that we're going to be involved in anything that's the Americas. And however, that's often been done with some amount of independence to these nations. And I say some amount because we've done things like invaded Haiti, Dominican Republic, Haiti several times, been involved propping up terrible governments in El Salvador and Guatemala, things like that. There's been U.S. cooperation with the junta in Argentina, dictator Pinochet in Chile, with the military dictatorship in Brazil, and some horrible things there. We were involved in the overthrow of President Allende in Chile. It's 1823 when Monroe actually tells Congress that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to new European colonization. And any attempt by them to do this would be viewed as a threat not just to that nation, say Guatemala or Honduras, but to the U.S. This is happening as nations are starting to revolt against Spain and becoming independent nations. At the same time, he said the United States would not interfere in existing European colonies. So you had French and British colonies that already existed, and that it would stay out of Europe's internal wars. Applied to Venezuela, you might say that the Monroe Doctrine doesn't provide a clean legal or historical justification for just using U.S. military in all the Americas. And if an administration's asserting that, it's a new assertion on their part. It might be rooted in some of the notes of the Monroe Doctrine, but it's not the Monroe Doctrine itself. This is not getting involved to block a foreign power, but getting involved directly with a Latin American country. I also think that while the noble part of the Monroe Doctrine is that kind of anti-colonial shield that we wanted to put on the other nations in the Americas, and it's, by the way, I think it's not like it's just Monroe says something and then we fast forward to today. It's been evoked. It's been in practice. I mean, there was an attempt during the Benjamin Harrison administration to have a large conference of Latin American nations that was mostly going to be a way of the U.S. having a lot of influence there. We've always sort of done this. But I think that if you're asserting that the U.S. now has this absolute control over this hemisphere, there's two issues. One, of course, is that these nations have sovereignty, and we claim to respect that. We probably want to respect that. There's international laws that we've agreed to. That's never a popular thing to say these days, international law, but there is. All of those things, we've engaged in the world as respecting their sovereignty, and breaking that sovereignty is always a little bit of a mark against us in diplomacy in the future. But the second thing, if you don't care about that, is if you're saying the U.S. has control over this hemisphere, expect another country, looking at Russia, but there could be others, to say, well, we have control over our area. You stay in your corner, we got this. And it creates a justification for someone, a regional actor, to say, yeah, the U.S. shouldn't be here either. We won't go in the Western Hemisphere, but we expect you out of here. And so those are things that will be dealt with as this thing goes forward. But I thought that I would, having last talked about this topic of war powers in 2011, that I would talk about it again. Like a lot of things, can't really answer the questions except to say that Congress has addressed this issue, and it probably should be at least complied with in the steps, the very limited and weak steps that are required as we work out the larger issues on the political stage. Because of what has happened, and this often happens with my podcast, 20 years now, I'm pretty used to this. I'm pushing off the Zachary Taylor episodes by a few days, so you'll get that later in the week. I want to thank you for listening. If you want to join the Patreon, there's going to be a lot more there. Shout out to Houston Roberts, who had engaged me on this topic, and thanks a lot.